We are live now. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. A warm welcome to day 5 of the third International Conference and Pop Festival for Youth-led Climate Action 2021. We are delighted to have you all join us for one of the biggest youth-led events for climate action. My name is Drisha Pathak. I'm a public health professional and a pop youth mentor at the Pop Movement. The Pop family is excited to welcome you to this workshop, which will focus on the topic which will focus on inviting our esteemed guests to talk about the perspective from the government's point of view. And this day kicks off with the POP US edition featuring close to 15 sessions. The days June 9th and 10th, 2021 will focus on youth-led climate action in the United States. Co-presented by FXB Climate Advocates, the session will bring together public leaders, academics, civil society members, activists, and youth through project presentation, panel discussions, dialogues, and workshops. Advocacy, environmental justice, climate migration, plastic pollution, youth-led climate leadership, Native American youth leadership, impact investment, and other themes will be topics of focus. The step up youth-led efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, promote renewable energy, and adaptive capacity to climate change impacts by amplifying diverse voices and action, showcasing sub-national efforts to integrate climate change measures into the policies, strategies, and planning, and engage youth and the most vulnerable communities in this process will be the main focus of these 2 days. Demonstrating institutional capacity and action to improve climate education and strengthens resilience in school and university settings while promoting meaningful youth participation will be our main target. With that, I would like to introduce and invite Ms. Karina Weston, Program Strategy and Innovation Director, FXB International. Karina joined FXB in 2015 and she led the organization Climate Change Strategic Program since then. Previously, she was a program associate with the Association of Junior Leagues International, where she built the capacity of junior leagues in their community and impact programs. Now, I would like to invite Karina to take over the session, and she will be the host and moderator for this session. Over to you, Karina.
Thank you so much, Drisha, and thank you so much to the POP family for giving this opportunity to FXB USA to collaborate with you for the US edition of the POP Festival. It's been a real privilege and really exciting for us to think through how to best amplify and support youth climate advocacy and all the different dimensions. So today we're really excited for our first panel focusing on the role of government in propelling climate action, specifically local government. And I am very humbled to introduce our speaker today, Louise Yeung. She's the Director of Resiliency at the New York City Department of Transportation, where she focuses on transforming social and physical systems to address the climate crisis. A dedicated public servant, Louise has worked to reduce carbon emissions, support the Green New Deal through offshore wind projects, and strengthen community resilience to sea level rise, heat, and coastal storms. Louise also serves on the board of directors for Sustain US, a youth-led climate justice organization that empowers youth to advance justice and sustainability. So I'm going to turn it over to Louise, and just please feel free to type in questions into the chat box as Louise is presenting. And then when at the end of the presentation, we'll have time for questions and answers. And we want to make this as dynamic and interactive as possible. So thank you so much, Louise, for your time. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Louise. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Karina. And it's so nice to meet with you all today. I'm really excited. I am, as Karina mentioned, currently the Director of Climate Resiliency at the New York City Department of Transportation. And I spent about more than 10 years working on climate issues in governments in Chicago, where I grew up, in Washington, DC, and now in New York City. I'd love to know where you all are from too. So if you want to type in the chat where you are zooming in from today, that would be great to know. I'm drawn to government work because I really believe in the power of public service. that all people, regardless of where we live, how long we've lived there, our race, what jobs we have, or what schools we attend, that we all have a right to stable housing, accessible parks, well-maintained transit, clean air and water, and other basic needs. My particular focus has been how cities can lead transformative climate action. And I've worked at different scales of government, from international to local. I have an undergraduate degree in international affairs and a master's in urban planning. And today I'm going to talk about the different ways that government can impact climate change and how young people can get involved in public service and hopefully inspire some of you to consider going into public service yourself. So before I jump into all of that, I wanted to take a quick poll to see what experience any of you have had with government at any scale before. So I'm going to open the poll and give you a second to respond. That's amazing. I see a couple of people have not had experience with government yet, but want to in the future. A couple people have voted, which is great. And I know not all of you may be eligible to vote yet, but hopefully soon. See if there's any other stragglers coming in, but it's pretty good. And that's really awesome. I'm glad to introduce you to a couple of different ways that governments can impact climate change. So it's about 50-50. Let me close that. Okay, so, moving on. So when we talk about government, there's actually lots of different levels of government, each of which have different ways of addressing climate issues. At the highest level, there's the United Nations, which brings around 200 countries together to address shared issues that require action and cooperation across country lines and country borders. So two important things that the UN does to address climate change are, first, to convene the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the main body that produces our global climate science research. And that helps make sure that everyone in the world is working off of the same body of knowledge on climate science. It informs how policymakers can develop recommendations for how we approach our climate goals. That's where the UN climate negotiations come in. You may have heard of the Paris Agreement, which was the global treaty signed in 2016 that set a shared target of reducing emissions to 2 degrees Celsius, or preferably 1.5 degrees, to avoid irreversible damages to our planet. The UN is made up of a lot of different federal governments from all different countries. And federal governments are really important because they pass legislation, they develop regulations, and provide critical sources of funding and investment in public infrastructure to combat climate change. In the US, some examples that you may have heard of are legislations proposed, like the Green New Deal, or different regulations set, for example, by the EPA for emission standards for car manufacturing, and other key decisions of whether to invest in new kinds of pipelines or new energy infrastructure. And lastly, there's local governments. These are city and town governments or state governments that make important decisions about how all of those broader policies that I mentioned can actually be implemented in practice. Local governments shape how our buildings can be designed, where our transportation networks go, how our patterns of development look when we decide where housing or commercial businesses or industry and park spaces are located in our neighborhoods. And together, all of these different levels of government play a significant role in coming together to address the climate crisis. City governments in particular have been at the forefront of climate action, and the focus on cities is becoming more and more crucial because half of the world's population lives in cities today, and by 2050, that's expected to jump to 70% of the world's population. So even though some countries at the federal level have been slow to make progress on Paris Agreement commitments, many cities are forging ahead. For example, when President Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement, over 450 mayors in America signed on to uphold the goals of the Paris Agreement despite what the federal government was doing. And I'm personally really drawn to the city level because it also helps make climate action feel very real and tangible and concrete when we can understand how it impacts us closer to home and what we can do to change it. Some examples of that are with transportation, for instance, the sector where I work. Transportation makes up about 30% of all US carbon emissions, primarily coming from people who drive cars. City governments make really important decisions like whether or where to build new bike lanes, where bus routes should go, how our streets look and feel so that pedestrians and cyclists can move safely when using the roads. And when city governments invest in safe and reliable transit, walking and biking infrastructure, it provides people with low carbon ways to get around and reduces our emissions from driving. In the US, buildings emissions accounts for about 15% of all carbon emissions. And in dense cities like New York, where I live, buildings actually make up 70% of emissions, and so are a really crucial aspect of how we tackle climate change. We don't often think about why our neighborhoods look or feel the way they do, but a lot of things within city government actually govern how our buildings are designed, from the height of the buildings to the size of them, to how they're heated and cooled inside. And all of these decisions are intentional, that we have codified in building codes. But sometimes the rules that we made in our building codes years and years and years ago don't really make sense anymore. And as we seek to change our physical environment to address climate change, we also need to look at those fundamental building blocks of how we build our cities. So 2 years ago, New York City passed a few monumental laws about this. One of them set building emissions limits, which was a really big game changer for both new construction and existing buildings. So we have to invest in energy efficiency and in renewable resources in order to meet those targets. And another set of laws requires now all new buildings to have either green roofs or solar roofs. And so these have really transformed the way that architects, engineers, construction companies, and designers are looking to actually build and renovate all of the stock to be more low carbon and energy efficient. All of this is, of course, tied back to where we get our energy resources from. Nationally, a quarter of our country's emissions comes from electricity production that is based on fossil fuel generation, such as coal or natural gas fracking or oil drilling. And the majority of cities and towns where we use our electricity are actually getting it from other places, which means they have to be transmitted across long distances. You may have heard of the proposals like the Keystone XL pipeline, or right now, it's been in the news a bit, the Line 3 pipeline that are trying to transmit natural gas across the country. So this is where governments can play a really big role in actually reducing our reliance on fossil fuels by choosing to invest in renewable energy sources and making larger purchases of renewable energy sources that are really changing the dynamics of where we actually are drilling or doing tar sands or fracking. So in addition to solar panel and wind farms, many coastal states in the East Coast and the Gulf Coast region are also looking to make really big investments in offshore wind, which are wind turbines that are in the ocean. Sometimes you can't even see them, they're far out. But that they are anticipated to harness the winds blowing through our oceans to produce a lot of clean energy that can reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. In addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which was the focus of the past few strategies that I mentioned, we also are looking to address the impacts of climate change. These impacts, like hurricanes, sea level rise, wildfires, and droughts, are happening now and will become more severe in the future across the globe if we don't continue to reduce our emissions. And to protect our most vulnerable communities from devastating impacts of climate change, a lot of governments are investing more in rain gardens, restoring wetlands to reduce flooding from heavy rains or hurricanes, and supporting plants that are more drought tolerant, even looking at controlled burns of prairies and forests to reduce incidents of unwanted destructive wildfires. And not only do these natural landscapes help us reduce climate emissions, but they're climate impacts, but they're also natural carbon sinks, which means that trees and our wetlands and our prairie areas capture greenhouse gases so they're not released into the atmosphere. These are all decisions that city governments and local and federal governments are making about where to invest in our natural resources, how to protect them, and make sure that we still have natural areas that are serving our Earth. So that was a really short overview of how governments are actually working on climate change in practice. And I can go on into lots of detail about each and every one. If you have any questions in the chat, definitely feel free to ask. And there's plenty more that I didn't talk about. But for now, I wanted to end with some ideas of how you can get involved in public service if you are interested. A lot of state and local governments have youth councils that offer formal opportunities for young people to advise on important issues like climate change and other kinds of topics. You can check your local government's website to see if they offer a youth council. There's at least 140 across the country in the US. And the YMCA actually has a really awesome youth and government program that has national partnerships that you may be able to plug into in your home state or home city. Whenever there are new parks or bike lanes or bus routes or other things that I mentioned, other important projects that are being designed in communities, there's always a public meeting. I don't know if any of you have seen the TV show Parks and Recreation, which is just sort of like a funny take on small town public service. But it is true that there's lots of public meetings that invite residents to share feedback about how projects are meeting the needs of communities and making sure that that voices are heard when these projects are being built and designed. Most public meetings are advertised through local government websites or community group websites. And from my experience, young people are really, really underrepresented at public meetings, even though the investments that we are making today have really lasting impacts for future generations. And so I really see if there's any kind of projects going on with park improvements or other things in your community that you can actually get involved with. These are two flyers of some public meetings. One is a project that I've been involved with flood protection, flood wall systems in Lower Manhattan, and we often we'll advertise these through newspapers, radio, TV, print, and actually distribute flyers to people's homes, make sure they're available in different languages and with sign language interpretation to make it accessible to everybody who can participate. And it's been a really humbling experience to actually be able to design public meetings that really try to reach people at where they are and make sure that it's really accessible. On the end of being a planner, I really take a lot of pride in how we create really equitable public meetings. Moving away from local level, but to the international scale, as a young person, you can not only get involved in issues near you, but also participate at the highest levels of governance. And many people actually don't know that young people can go to climate negotiations or other UN negotiations. For the last decade, I've been working with a climate justice organization that Karina mentioned called Sustain Us, that trains and supports young people to advocate for equitable climate futures at the UN. And I think it's really cool because it's entirely run and led by youth and brings people into the UN space. You can actually, the UN has an official youth constituency group called Yeung. That is a bunch of global youth coming together to address climate change from all different countries. And it's been a really powerful way for youth perspectives and voices to be heard and integrated into global decisions. Young people have been, for the past, for as long as the climate negotiations have been going on, have been the strongest advocates and have really pushed global leaders to strive for more ambitious emissions targets in the Paris agreements and other kinds of climate justice issues to actually embed them into these treaties. In 2019, Sustain Us sent the first all Indigenous US youth delegation to the climate talks, and it was so powerful to hear frontline Indigenous youth share their histories of natural resource management and how climate change affects them directly. Any young person between the ages of 13 and 29 living in the US, regardless of your citizenship, can join Sustain Us. So, highly encourage you to see if you're interested in some of their programming. In addition, we can also advocate our elected representatives who need to be responsive to what their constituents want to hear. And so advocating for climate action is one really powerful way to push for climate change. The Sunrise Movement, as one example, has hubs all over the US to engage in climate campaigns. And the Climate Justice Alliance is a coalition of different environmental justice groups around the country. And you can find member groups there that you can get involved with through their website. I would be remiss not to plug a job in public service and in government. Getting involved in some way in public service is a really amazing opportunity to give back to your community and shape important decisions that affect all our lives. You don't have to be an urban planner to do that. That is what I do, but there's lots of ways, whether it's through library systems, community gardens, working as EMTs, and even in the public, even in the urban planning space that I'm in, there's all sorts of professions, architects, landscape architects, engineers, translators, all sorts of people who are working on different projects and being educators that can help address climate change with working with the public. And lastly, we need more bright, caring young people in public office. Maybe that looks like finding a really cool candidate that you're excited about running for office in your area, whether it's city council or Congress or the president. Lead Locally is a really cool organization that I love that helps elect climate leaders into office, and they have all sorts of things up like down ballot. So a lot of times they're highlighting roles and races that I didn't even know about that have really big impact on climate change. One example here is somebody who's running for San Antonio City Council. There's another person that they're highlighting who's running for the chair of the Seattle Port, which I didn't realize was an elected position. But there's so many different things that the ports do that emit carbon emissions. And so that's such a powerful way for us to hold our elected officials accountable. And maybe this is not for you right now, but even considering running for office yourself one day, there's an organization called Run for Something that helps train and give resources to people who are even considering running for office in the future, and they help think about what your candidacy can look like. So I wanted to leave you with some of those different ideas of how governments work in the climate. And just as a little end note, I wanted to ask you, from all that you've heard today, what excites you, and where do you think you might want to plug in, if at all? So I just opened the poll now. To recap: joining a youth council, weighing in on a local community project, engaging in global climate negotiations, advocating for climate action, working in public service, electing climate leaders, and running for office. Let me know what you think. Oh, cool! Someone wants to run for elected office. That's amazing. I'd love to support you. And another person is interested in engaging in UN negotiations, which is also really amazing. So I'm going to share the results here. I know, Karina, you were going to help to moderate the Q&A. I see that there's some chats over here. Lots of people from lots of different places: Mexico City, Gulf Coast, Sierra Leone. How amazing. So Karina, do you want to?
Sure, so we have a question. Thank you so much, Louise, for that inspiring presentation and for the really useful tips and really actionable items that you can take away. I learned a lot about different organizations that can support young people. So let's take a question from Michelle. How can other cities model some of the success that the New York City Department of Transportation has had in promoting resiliency?
Thank you, Michelle, for that question. I will start off by saying that I also learn a lot from other places too. And there's a lot of different organizations that help share knowledge across different transportation agencies. And so there's a ton that I've been learning from. For example, Miami, they've been doing some really interesting work on sea level rise, as just one example. But in terms of the New York City transportation sector, I think one really impactful thing that we have done is actually create a Department of Resiliency. It sounds, rather basic, but having dedicated people to think about climate change and thinking about climate impacts, that is my team's entire job. And a lot of transportation agencies don't actually have that as like a standalone group who can work on those issues. And so even just understanding, what the climate impacts are in that are facing all the different transportation systems, and actually being stewards of those issues, I think can go a really long way in making sure that all transportation decisions are addressing climate change, whether it's making low carbon investments or adapting our systems to hurricanes and sea level rise and other issues.
Thank you for that question, Michelle. And I have a question for Louise as well. What are some of the biggest challenges with getting the government to address climate change? And what do you see as possible strategies to confront these challenges?
Yeah, thank you. I think it really depends, like we were talking about, there's so many, like government is actually not one thing, it's actually so many different scales. And so I think it can depend where you are in the country, or, in some places where people are more reliant on cars, or maybe, unfortunately in the US, it's become quite a political issue where climate change is seen as very polarizing. And so I think that if you're in an area where that is maybe more of the case, you're facing a lot of different political challenges to even get people to acknowledge that climate change is real. This is not the case for New York, but I know that, I don't know why I'm like using Florida as an example so much, but a few years ago in Florida, the governor was a climate denier and was banning the use of the words climate change in official government policies and plans. And so that made it really hard for people to do their jobs. And they kind of had to find other ways of talking about it. So if that's the case in where you live, that's a really different kind of challenge. In New York, I think because Hurricane Sandy was so devastating in 2012, and New York just has different politics. The main issue that I have observed is just the funding, getting funding to invest in projects, because sometimes it's just really expensive to do things that are different from the way we've done them before, or people don't like change. They're used to things. So when New York passed the legislation to mandate solar roofs and green roofs and limit building emissions, a lot of the construction and real estate industry was really did not like that legislation because it was going to make some of their construction more expensive. And I think part of that is we have to grapple with the fact that transforming our world to address climate change needs to change the way that we do things. And we can't just do things the way they were done before. And there's always going to be people who are pushing against that. So part of it is like money, and part of it is just like a mentality of like, we prioritize climate change and we're willing to do what it takes to reduce our emissions to avoid global catastrophe,
Yeah, thank you. That was a very thoughtful answer. We have a question from Dr. Ash Pachauri. To what extent do you observe cross-domain collaboration and policymaking? So is it siloed, or do you see different agencies working together?
Yeah, I think it really depends, again, like, a lot of how governments are structured. I can speak for New York most specifically. There are definitely some places where we're siloed. For example, in the transportation world, we deal with a lot of hard infrastructure, like stuff that we like built infrastructure, and we don't really manage a lot of natural resources. But there are so many ways where natural areas are connected to transportation, and where we might want to combine those two kinds of things. And so that's sometimes where I see some silos of like, DOT is full of transportation engineers and are not used to thinking about landscapes, or aren't used to thinking about natural solutions to address sea level rise, for instance. So there are definitely some silos, but one of the things that I really love about working in climate change in New York is that by this point, especially because of Hurricane Sandy, most of the city agencies have a Department of like me, like a Department of Climate Resiliency. And so I have counterparts in the Department of Housing, in the Parks Department, in the mayor's office, in the Department of City Planning, like all of these different agencies where those are my main collaborators. And those are the forums where we get together on a regular basis and talk through how do we break down some of those silos, and where are there places where there are needs in the housing space for transportation that we actually need to be talking to each other. For instance, there's an area in Southeast Queens that is just getting flooded so regularly by heavy rainfall or even light rainfall. And it's not only a housing issue for how to help people get access to flood insurance and things like that, but it's a transportation issue because the roadways are not, you can't walk through them, you can't drive through them. And so that's an area where I've really worked with some of the housing advocates in a way that I would never have gotten to do if we were just kind of working in our own little agencies by ourselves, because we all live in a place, and that place involves so many different kinds of things, from trees to houses to roadways, and we all have to kind of talk to each other. So always more to improve for sure. But yeah, it's been a really nice thing to know who my counterparts are in those other agencies.
Thank you so much. And one of the things that when we work with young people is that we encourage young people to articulate their climate story, what motivates them to act. So I'm curious for you, Louise, what motivated you to get involved with this work with urban planning and climate change?
Yeah, I have always really been interested in environmental issues. I didn't grow up in a particularly natural area. I grew up in the city of Chicago. So, but it was always really interesting to me how people brought nature into the city and how I was able to access it. And I think my climate journey has really been one of finding where I want to engage. It's been, even though I've worked in climate change for a long time, I haven't really kind of landed on local government until 5 years ago or 6 years ago. And so I first thought I was interested in international issues. And then I just kind of tried out a lot of different ways. Then I got into climate organizing, and I liked that, but I found that for my own personality, organizing was something that kind of took a lot of energy from me. And even though I support organizers and I work with a lot of them, I realized maybe that's not quite the way that I want to plug in. And then I got involved in city government, and I found that to be kind of the right mix for me right now, at least today. And that might change in the future. But I really like the mix of working with communities directly and engaging with residents, but also thinking about how the systems of cities work. And it kind of really allows me to go back and forth between the big picture and the very micro scale that people live in. And so I think what part of my climate journey has also just been realizing that at different times in my life, I've wanted different things. And so the things that I wanted when I was younger, right out of college, and I had a lot of energy for organizing and campaigning, is really different than the way that I am excited to be involved now. And so my I guess thought that I leave young people with often is it doesn't have to be picking one thing and the rest of the doors are closing off to you. Try out different ways of engaging in climate issues. And for a while I was really interested in ecology and climate change, and I did a lot of ecological field work, actually working in kind of landscape restoration and management. And I really liked that for a while. And it's just different, but it kind of led me to different paths. And so, yeah, my climate story has been one of just kind of trying out a lot of different ways of thinking about climate change. And I feel like that's really enriched how I think about climate issues as being very interconnected, and also how to center people first and foremost in that. That's been part of my practice as well, and making sure that environmental justice communities and people who are bearing the most impact of climate change can be at the forefront of that conversation. So I really feel yeah, trying out all these different spaces has given me really good perspective to understand how people feel climate change in their daily lives.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. And that's really important for young people to know that it's not a linear path. It's not just, grassroots activism. That's one strategy. There's policy and you could try different things. And in reality, there's so much needed to address the issue of climate change. So I love your story and just all the different things you've tried and where you found your place. That's really powerful and really valuable for young people. You mentioned at the end about environmental justice. How do you, how does environmental justice intersect with your work at the Department of Transportation? How does that inform the priorities and the work that you do?
I think it's really deeply connected, not just for transportation, but for all like city and other kinds of government work. Environmental justice communities are often the ones who have borne legacy, like decades and decades of legacies of pollution, disinvestment. Like a lot of times these coincide with communities that have been redlined, which are like redlining is the horrible practice in the United States where Black people were prohibited from buying houses in certain areas. It was just a racist policy. But there's a lot of legacies of that, of where people of color and specifically Black Americans live today. And that really ties to transportation because a lot of times those are also the same communities that have health impacts from that kind of legacy of pollution and disinvestment. And so when you have elevated rates of asthma or respiratory illness, a lot of times, the transportation emissions in those areas people are much more sensitive to that. And so how we are thinking about where we are citing our transportation, like taking down highways, like that's been a really big, powerful movement. When highways became popular in America in like the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of decisions that put highways right through communities. And it not only cut communities off from other, like jobs or libraries or other things that they were, the community amenities, but it also meant that there's a lot of pollution coming through from those highways. And so now I feel like a lot of the transportation world is trying to undo the harms that past transportation decisions have done. And it definitely ties to environmental justice, and it ties to race and racial justice and climate justice, because those legacies don't go away very fast, and they're so ingrained in how our cities look. And so we've been having really hard and important conversations in New York about some of the highways that cut through the South Bronx or that cut through Southeastern Queens, and what can we do to maybe kind of like, do we need those highways anymore? People are so used to them that it's hard for some people to envision, not being able to drive from in that way. But I think we need to really be mindful of putting our environmental justice communities first and foremost, and start investing in those communities, as opposed to kind of saying to them, it's for the greater good. Like, you have to suffer, you have to have a highway through your neighborhood because other people want to be more convenienced. And so, yeah, I feel like a lot of our work is really unpacking the harms, that we've perpetuated in a really like intentional and thoughtful way.
Yeah, thank you. That's really powerful. I think, making sure that young people understand the structural kind of causes of some of the issues, and of course, to take action to address them. That's really important. So as we wrap up the session, I wanted to ask you one last question. If there are any words of, inspiration or guidance for young people as kind of we emerge from COVID, or in this kind of post-COVID advocacy on climate change, if there are any words of guidance that you would provide to young people?
Yeah, I guess my word of guidance, if I had to pick one, is like, give yourself the space to envision, like, what does that future look like that you want? Like, what does it look like to have a just future, to have a future where climate change, we've tackled it, and we that we've achieved climate justice in some way, or a future where we have we have more equitable, like a more equitable world. And what does that look like? And then how do we bring that vision into today? Like, whatever career you become, whether you go into like science or the humanities, or teaching, or anything, I feel like that act of imagining like that future that we want is so powerful and can really bring that back into then how we bring ourselves to the world every day. I feel like urban planning is a discipline of imagining a possible future. And if we stop realizing what's possible, we kind of get locked into these mentalities that are really hard to change. And I think as people get older, that is something that happens. And so, you know, especially for young people, but also for adults, like how do we keep that practice of imagining what that future can be so we're not limiting the possibilities for ourselves today?
That's really powerful and a really important message, I think, for all of us, young people and young at heart. And that's a really, you know, it's been a tough year and a tough time for the world with the pandemic. And I think just staying positive and trying to envision exactly the kind of future we want and the kind of communities we want to live in is really important. And our job as, you know, adults and professionals to guide young people and support young people on this journey. So thank you so much, Louise. We really appreciate your thoughtful presentation, and it's very informative and leaves young people with a lot of tools and better understanding of what government can do. And hopefully you'll have many future public servants as a result of your presentation. So we're really thrilled to complete our first panel on the role of government. And we have an exciting agenda for the rest of the day as well. So thank you. I don't know if Trisha or Komal want to say something.
Thank you so much. It was so lovely to meet all of you, and I'm excited to see what the future holds for you.
Thank you.
I would like to ask Dr. Ash if he wants to say something before we close out the session.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just want to convey my thanks for this absolutely enlightening session. And I think you brought up so many important things, but most importantly, you've given us practical strategies to become involved, you know, and also be engaged in formulating and driving that future. And I think that that is the critical that's the key to take away. So I just want to say thank you for sharing your experience. I think, you know, one of the most important things is when you have a personal narrative to inspire young people. And I just want to say, you know, you exemplify that. And clearly you have you have so much passion in what you're saying and you're doing. And I think that is something that all the young people here and those that are going to be listening in need to be aware of and take away. You know, no doubt, I think young people have a critical part to play in deciding, you know, where things need to go, and it's important that we work in a collaborative manner. So I just want to underscore the point that young people do need to play a part. It's not enough to say the system needs to do this or the system needs to do that. I think we all have a role to play, and that system will be formulated and carved out in the manner that we envision. And like you rightly said, you know, that we have to let our imaginations drive us. And you know, your work and you yourself actually are a living, breathing example of that. So I just want to say how important everything that you've shared with us is, and we take away this very important message. No doubt would love to seek your thoughts and your ideas and your blessings as young people proceed and progress in each of the different geographies we're in. And I think one very important thing for all youth who are listening in is that, you know, you can affect change at the local level, but also at the global level. And thank you for bringing that up, because I think that's a very, very important and no doubt extremely powerful message for you to send out to all of us. And so with that, I just want to say that we are very blessed and grateful to have you here. And thank you very, very much for sharing your own personal journey, narrative, and experience. And we are very much looking forward to continuing our collaboration. I want to thank Karina very, very much for helping to conceptualize and bring us all together here. And also Komal, Trisha, Priyanka, and all the amazing young people, Michelle, Meda, Nitya, Kevin, and Ishan, who's just joined us, for being a part of this and for really helping to make this happen. So thank you ever so much. I know by coming together, we will make the change that we want to see in the world. So thank you ever so much once again. And we're in this together. So lots more to come and all good things. So have a wonderful day. And I'm really looking forward to all that lies ahead for us together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ash.
Thank
We'd like to
you.
extend, thank you, Karina. We would like to extend our deepest gratitude to our expert for joining us today and to all the participants. We hope to see you in the next session of the day, which is right after 15 minutes, on climate education, on advocacy and climate education. Thank you so much once again for joining us, and see you all. If you have to put out post on social media, do not forget to use the hashtag PopFestival 2021. Thank you.